Around 5 years ago, I stood on the TEDx stage and with the indignant assurance of a 12-year-old who had not done her research, presented my ideas on how to change the education system. And although my theories were terribly wrong, to say the least, the education system, in response, grabbed my hand, patted me on the head, and said, "Don't worry about that talk. I'll show you exactly what's wrong with me." But in all seriousness, I entered high school with the optimism that as much as I was aware of the issues on the table, there was no way they could manifest themselves into my reality as a student. And upon entering a 2,000-kid high school with 60% of which being considered economically disadvantaged, with a college readiness index of 12.3 out of 100, a reading proficiency rate of 42%, and a math of 43, the failures of the education system became my reality. But nonetheless, I want to first thank you for allowing me to attempt to redeem myself within the TED community and, in an ode to my 12-year-old self, reevaluate the education system. To contextualize, American public schools are funded largely on property taxes, so that area wealth quantifies the resource means a school is to have, and in turn, the quality of the education being provided. And although this funding was shifted slightly in the 1970s with the induction of the School and Tax Reform Acts, the level of stratification that still occurs is stark. So much so that an analysis of over 200 million state accountability tests found that students in affluent districts gain almost a year in proficiency when compared to that of the poorest. So much so that solely growing up in a disadvantaged community defaces verbal ability to the equivalent of missing almost a year in school. And this cyclical pattern emerges where wealthy families avoid marginalized school districts with good reasons, but the poor are further stratified at the expense of virtually their future. And where the classes are separated to such an extent that perspective is being taught around a group of students that represent a homogeneous demographic. And it raises the question, in my mind at least, how, as a population that values education to such an extent that 85% of current jobs and 90% of new jobs require some or more college education, and yet we willingly allow state governments to compartmentalize each tax bracket into a school district in which income will determine the value of that education. How have we been okay with this? How are we okay with this for the past 50, 60 years as class mobility continues to decline, as headlines like America Divided find themselves within 30 million plus news articles talking about our polarization, and yet the last place we're willing to turn to find a solution is in education? And ironically, out of this, another question arises, and that is, who is benefiting? Because it is only logical to assume that for a system to continue on this long with such ramifications, that there must be at least one winner that is pushing this forward. So let's consider the implications. When you're surrounded by a group of students from the same background, both financially and socially, who look and act in virtually the same way you do, a normal is created. If at your school every student has a car by their 16th birthday, then the question for someone who doesn't becomes a why rather than taking into consideration. But nonetheless, our normals are the basis for our comparisons. If my normal is directly related to my reality outside of school, then my comparisons are stagnant in the experience. And so long as we accept our normals, then there isn't room for growth. There's no need for immediate change. And one, it creates a normal which builds complacency. And two, it creates a workforce in the benefit of separation. And although this may have been beneficial when coming out of high school, only a fraction was to attend college. But now we have a society that is so globalized that this division only limits us. And 3, it creates a culture distinctive to each class. And although this is somewhat quelled in attending college, the expectations still follow. In my public school, for example, prom culture extended itself to dresses and corsages, though in my new one, it became an extravaganza in which almost $100,000 in class funds would be extended to venues and rather extraneous decorations and the celebration of an event that mirrored a White House press dinner rather than that of high school prom. And both represent stark differences in how we view decadence and priority. But nonetheless, we have these 3 factors that work against each other and virtually against everyone in the long term. So when answering the question, who benefits, it becomes a way to weigh the ramifications of blatant segregation because we have lost all value within the education system. How, as a population, if no one is benefiting, can we accept that a child born into poverty is almost certain to remain in poverty as if it were Newton's law and still base legislation around the stratification of classes? How are adults okay with that? How can we be okay with that? And as much as we have continued this, and as much as politicians have said they will change the system, that they are education revolutionaries, their perspective is as limited. And more often than not, nothing changes. We have allowed apology to circumvent actual policy since 1971. So how do we reverse these factors? How do we take what we have been giving students and switch that? Because it isn't about fixing the broken education system. The education system isn't broken. It was never broken. It was built on the idea that 60% of us are meant to occupy jobs that only 2% of us do today. So to reverse these factors, I think we often first need to realize that we've been ascribing, as Hanlon Razor famously puts it, malice to which can be adequately described by stupidity. And if no one is benefiting, then why hasn't there been a change? So 1, I think we need to equalize district spending so that at least 90% of funds are allocated by the federal government. I think as students, we need to ask ourselves if our normals represent more than the demographics of the crowd. I think when a student comes into class with more responsibilities than homework on their plate, they aren't reprimanded. We need to diversify schools beyond race and cultural barriers. And I think if we've learned anything over the past 50 years, it's that that change does not lie in politicians' hands. As students, we need to decide we deserve better. So let's demand better. Thank you.